friends. It's Jeff Hudson with Relational Gravity and the My Penny Earned Financial Wellness Service. Welcome to the Relational Podcast, where we learn to make a difference to those we serve, including both our customers and employees. This episode is the fifth in a series focused on issues relevant to organization leaders, business owners, and their advisors. Today's discussion takes a different turn. As a leader or advisor, you likely have aging family members and friends, as well as clients or colleagues who face similar challenges. That makes today's topic particularly relevant to you. Why? Research from Columbia University reveals that nearly 1 in 10 older Americans is living with dementia, including 35% of those in their 90s. In August, I addressed the financial risks posed by dementia to nearly 300 retirees at the Retired Indiana Public Employees Association annual convention. Although my audience was primarily aging parents and grandparents, this issue resonates deeply with those who care for them, which can include organization leaders, advisors, sons, daughters, and grandchildren. What follows is my conversation with those retirees. Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be back with you again. Some of you have been coming here for a few years, may have gotten tired of hearing from me, but that's okay. I'm happy to be here and got some interesting things I think to talk about with you today. One of the things we're going to do first off is anybody here from Wayne County? There was an author there who, his name is Tom Mullen, and he was a dean at the Earlham School of Religion. And when I was in my early 30s, he wrote a book called Living Longer and Other Sobering Possibilities. And he wrote that as he was into his 60s. And I read the book because I knew the man. I thought he was a great guy. And I thought, well, that's an interesting book. I'll tell you, I reread it here in the last few weeks. And I realized that as I'm entering my 60s, it's a lot more relevant. One of the things he said in the book was, everybody wants to live a long time, but nobody wants to get old. So, see, if I'm not funny, I can quote funny people. So, alternatives to growing older, however, are sobering, and it's best not to rush the aging process, but to accept it. To some extent, we can plan for it, and when we pass 60, we reap certain benefits that otherwise are not available to us. And I think he mentioned grandkids and some things like that too. So I just thought that was interesting. I don't know if the book's in print, but if you're interested in it, come see me and I'll give you my copy because I think I have another copy at home too. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a few things. First off, we're going to talk about financial well-being and what it means to you. You'll all remember, and as Jessica mentioned, we did a survey a little over a year ago that talked about what is the financial well-being of Indiana public retirees, and we've also done one on Indiana public employees who are approaching retirement. We'll talk about sources of income for Indiana's public employees. Where do you get your money? I've done the same survey with other groups in other states, and you're different than other states. And of course, we're from Indiana. We have to be different. We're going to talk about managing your retirement income, and I think that's going to play nicely into your next two speakers also. Then we're going to talk a little bit about risk. Are you at risk with your self-managed income solutions? And we're going to talk just a little bit about dementia, if I remember. I might not remember. We'll see. So first off, let's talk about financial well-being and say, what is financial well-being? We're using a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau definition of this. So your definition also may be based on your personal experiences, and so it may differ too. But first off, it's the extent to which you feel you have control of your day-to-day, month-to-month finances. Now, we all know if you live long enough that control is something that's a bit of an illusion, but it is something we want to at least seek some stability to. So do you have control over your finances? Do you have the capacity to absorb a financial shock? Somebody, I'm sure, in this room in the last 30 days has had a hot water heater go out, or maybe had to take care of some air conditioning, or maybe had a flat tire or a car repair. So those financial shocks that are part of life, but they're not really expected, do you have the capacity to absorb that shock? Are you on track to meet your financial goals? Now, you're sitting in here, and many of you are retired. And people often make the mistaken assumption that, well, if you're retired, you don't really have to have financial goals. And my answer to that is, oh, you most certainly do. And I'm sure that many of you out here do have goals, and they still involve saying, how do I live the quality of life that I want to live? And that gets to that next item, and that is you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. So what do we know about financial well-being? There's a financial well-being score, and I could spend a lot of time going into how it's calculated. But the bottom line is this, that generally speaking, Indiana public employees and Indiana public retirees score reasonably well on the financial well-being scale. But if you compare public employees and public retirees to the nation as a whole and to Indiana as a whole, for those age groups, which would be 62 plus, you don't score quite as well. Now, I think that there's a reason for that. How many of you believe that you made some personal choices and sacrifices to go to work in a public job as opposed to pursuing employment in a private company job that may pay more money? Many of you made a sacrifice of public service, which I think is admirable, and that is reflected both in current employees and it's also reflected in retired public employees. So what we see here then is kind of a bell curve. You'll see that the items to the right are the various highest financial well-being. So about 25% of those, are actually almost 30% of those taking the survey, scored very high in financial well-being. What we've also seen there is that sometimes people have worked private sector jobs and then gone into public employment, so they have retirement from different places. But the majority of those of you in this room and those of you who took the survey were in that medium high to medium low financial well-being. And about 7-8% were in that very low financial well-being. There are people in this room and people who are RIPIA members who are struggling to make ends meet. And that's why that campaign for the 13th check in consideration of COLA was such a passion for your board members and for your lobbyists and the RIPIA staff. So let's then look at some things that we know about those who score in that medium-high range. First off, more than half have automated deposits into their savings or retirement accounts. Well, guess what? If you're a PERF retiree, you're getting an automated deposit someplace. Same for Social Security. But just a third always pay off their credit cards. So debt can be a problem for retirees, and debt can be a problem for Indiana public retirees. Again, if you have a crisis, are you using that credit card to say, you know what, I just blew up a tire, I've got to get a new tire, I don't have the cash for it, I have to use the credit card. So that sometimes forces us to use debt as an emergency fund. And a few, 16%, sometimes or often experience food insecurity, meaning that, until my check gets deposited, I'm going to be kind of getting to the bottom of the freezer and seeing what may have been there for 6 months that might be a little freezer burn, but I'm going to eat it. So now let's talk about retirement income. And we looked at a couple of things. One is how many sources of income do public employees have, Indiana public employees have? And then secondly, where are the dollars coming from that support them? And, one of the assumptions early on was that Indiana public employees have lots of different sources of income. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but think to yourself, do you have lots of different sources of income? Some of you do. I worked in private sector before I worked for the state of Indiana. I worked for the state of Indiana, and now I work outside again for myself. So I have different sources of income. But those of you who made a career of public service probably don't have as many sources of income. And what we know from the survey is that 78% of the respondents have no more than 2 sources of income in addition to PERF. Those sources of income then are very often, in addition to PERF, it's Social Security and then some money in a bank account. And some of you have had money in 457 plans, Hoosier Start, and other types of retirement savings plans too. So now that we've talked about what are your sources of income, and notice a lot of those were lifetime income sources. Social Security is a lifetime income source. And the Indiana Public Retirement System, your pension, is a lifetime source of income. Those are the 2 major sources of income. They may not be large sources of income, but they may be your main sources of income. And then that third source of income of drawing money out of a savings account, a bank savings account someplace. Now, we're going to talk about managing your retirement income. And while I've got an entire hour-long webinar on that, we're going to take like 1 or 2 slides here because we're going to move pretty quickly through this. But typically, a strategy for managing your retirement income and thinking about those sources of income is that your essential expenses, things like your utilities, got to keep the house warm or cool. Today it's going to be a hot day. Insurance, healthcare, things like that are things that are essential expenses that you're going to typically pay out of your lifetime income sources. And that could be your pensions, that can be your Social Securities. You're going to see the A word here, annuities. And you're going to hear more about annuities later today. And while I don't advocate or not advocate for annuities, they are a tool. And just like systematic withdrawals are a tool, just like home equity loans are a tool, that don't close your mind to, but just make sure you understand them because they can be a very important tool to you depending on your circumstances. Then you have your discretionary expenses. Some of you want to travel or do travel. Entertainment, that could even be your cable TV. Recreation of different sorts. And we know that we talk about retirees having those go-go years in their early years of retirement. We have what we call the slow-go years when things start slowing down a little bit. And then the no-go years where, most days you're not going anyplace, but let a grandkid get married and you're going to get up and you're going to do some slow-go or even some go-go, but come home and be tired for it. Those discretionary expenses are things that you often pay out of your managed income sources, self-managed income sources. And that's the key, and it's a key that we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. So, for instance, if you have retirement savings, if you left a perf cover position, you had money in your defined contribution account, or if you had money in a 457 Who's Your Start plan, and you said, I'm going to take that out a little piece every month, that's a source of income that you manage. Your assets, your employment income. A lot of people, more and more people, are working to older and older ages. I did a workshop on that a few weeks ago, and for 2 reasons. Number one, because many people retire and want to keep working. Sometimes they want to, sometimes they have to, sometimes it's a little bit of both. So those are things, though, that you manage to some degree. Now let's talk a little bit about something that's maybe not fun to talk about, but it doesn't have to be terrifying either. And that's the whole question of dementia in families, parents, and children. Let me ask a question first. How many of you, at some point in your life, were responsible for taking care of older grandparents? And how many of you were responsible for helping or taking care of older parents? Okay. Now, you've raised your hands and you know you've had those concerns. So I want to put you back in those positions when you were helping. We all are going to need people at some point in our lives. And so this risk that I'm going to talk about is both the risk that you have encountered when you're dealing with your older family members who have needed help, but that someday you may encounter. So why is dementia a risk? Particularly for those self-managed sources of income. Your retirement savings cash, your systematic withdrawal plans, your emergency savings accounts if you have those, if you're managing a reverse mortgage or anything else. People hit a point in life, some people, not all people, when they are not so good at managing those sources of income. And most people I talk to who are younger are absolutely confident that they're never going to need any help. But someday, a portion of us all are going to need help. I can remember helping my parents as they grew older, and they were both very smart, bright, intelligent people, but they hit a point in life when it was really hard for them to do things like manage their money. And so I helped them, but my wife reminded me as we were helping, don't forget that we need to be ready for this someday ourselves because it may happen to us. That's why self-managed income sources in particular can be at risk because they depend on somebody's continued cognitive ability. So the question is, if you're that person to help somebody else, or if you're that person who's going to need help, who do you think you would like to invite into your life to get that help? And think about it now, even though it's no fun to think about. Because what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to think about this, you're going to find someone that agrees to help you when you need help, and you have help, or guess what? You're going to find someone who says, yes, I'll help you someday, and you don't need the help. Either way, it's like insurance, only it just costs goodwill. So let's talk about what dementia is and some signs of it. Dementia is a general term for the impaired ability to remember, to think, to make decisions, and it interferes with doing everyday activities. While I joke a little bit about it kind of feels to me like maybe my mind isn't working as fast as it did 20 years ago. So, I worry about that, kind of legitimately. My wife, who's a nurse, says, you don't have to worry about that too much, but I do. But who has dementia? Nearly 1 in 10 older Americans has it to some level. If we look around this room, look to your right, look to your left, if there's 10 people sitting at your table, one of them probably has some level of dementia. That doesn't mean you're non-functional and doesn't mean you're incapable. It just means that it is part of growing older, and it's something that we all will likely battle someday. It includes 35% of those in their 90s. Now, lest that sound pessimistic, 2/3 of the people in their 90s don't have it. So if you're sitting here in your late 80s or your 90s, odds are you don't. But it's a good thing to be ready for. So what are some of the signs that we run into with this? Money problems may be one of the first noticeable signs of dementia. What does that include? How many of you in this room actually kind of like to have a little cash money and some change? I still miss my change drawer. My wife and I, when we got married some many years ago, paid for, I think it was a new dryer with all the change that I had collected in a garbage can over 10 years. So, I know. She didn't know about that till after we got married, and she's since reformed me. Counting change. People have trouble counting change. But trouble paying for a purchase, if you're checking out of a store or something like that, trouble just getting through that process. Calculating a tip. Now, what do we know? We go into a restaurant now, and they want you to do it. They hand you a little box, and you swipe their card on it, and then it says, do you want to give a 10% tip, a 20% tip, or a 100% tip? And you select. So maybe it's not so hard. There's also the issue of balancing the checkbook, and while most of us these days have an electronic checkbook, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with having a paper checkbook and real written checks, albeit that's a little old-fashioned now too. But balancing your checkbook is also, even if you're using online services, online banking, saying I'm going through and I'm reviewing my expenses and I'm understanding what they are and seeing that there's nothing surprising there. And that gets back to also understanding the bank statement, whether it's mailed to you or whether you're looking online, that ability to just get in there and grasp it and understand it. And many of you have worked with people in your family who you begin to see fade and have those problems. And some of the signs of that is, for instance, unopened and unpaid bills. And I would also say unopened bank statements. It's just a little bit more overwhelming, and it's anxiety producing to open those and try and make sense of them. And life is difficult enough anyway. So you might see significant new purchases on a credit card. Somebody using the credit card for things they ordinarily wouldn't have in the past. And unexpected new purchases that are showing up in the house. Maybe even in boxes that aren't getting opened. So watch for those signs. But what do we do about this? How can we help? I tend to be a person who can run at problems and sometimes not be as kind and gentle as I should be. So the good news is I grew up in a big family. I got 4 sisters and I got a brother. And I have a brother who is very talented financially, and he also has a very gentle manner about him. So as it turned out, those are people who are really good at helping other people with their finances and other support they might need as they go through a slowing down of life. So a gentle hand that offers support for budgeting and bill paying without being seen as overly controlling can protect the older adult. My experience with the older adults in my family is they only want the help they need. They don't want anything extra because they still want to make their life's decisions, and they have every right to do that. So you all remember when you were younger and you saw your parents getting older and you thought, I'm not sure that I would make the same decisions my parents make. I wish they'd do something different. And those of you who've raised kids had teenagers or college-age kids, and you had the same thing. And in both cases, you had to say, you know what, but they need to live their own lives. That's what you need here is when you're giving help or when you're receiving help, is receiving the gentle help you need without somebody saying, I want to live your life for you. Because age doesn't mean you have to give up freedom. So what do you need to do? You need to identify trusted help, whether that's for you or whether it's somebody in your family who needs that help, and you need to think through who is the best person to help that family member. Is it you or is it somebody else? In the case of my parents, my brother was the best person in the world to offer the limited financial help they needed. And I was the guy, because I used to work in healthcare and I'm married to a nurse, who said, I'll help out on things like transportation to doctor's appointments and things like that. And that worked out well for us. But what kind of help is out there? What kind of help do you need? If it's not family, are there close, trusted friends? And here's the other key, is that if you're going to be a helper, or if you're going to find a helper, make sure there's transparency. There's nothing worse than somebody coming in to help mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or a neighbor and nobody else really knowing what they're doing. So even if they're doing the most honorable things for that parent, without transparency, somebody may think that they're taking a little bit of money or taking advantage of that older person. So transparency is very important. Something important for your whole life is to create a budget. And I think particularly if you're going to be the helper, a budget is it's an agreement between you and the person you're helping. You shake hands and you say, this is what we're going to manage to. Automate bill paying could be a good idea. It just depends on the circumstances. So that's one of those you ask the question, do we want to do that or not? If there's cash flow issues in your account, then maybe you need to think about that. The next question I would ask is that what about you question. Now, how many of you in here are still working full-time in a perf covered job? Okay, so there's a few of you thinking, I'm working towards retirement. That day may come. Then there are people who are retired working part-time, as we've talked about. But the question is, what are the chances that you'll live long and eventually struggle with dementia? Well, as we talked about, if you live to be 90, the odds are you won't, because 2/3 of the people in their 90s don't have dementia. So that's the good news. But you can't control everything, and so do you want to have a contingency plan to say who's going to help? In the case of my wife and I, since we don't have children, we're thinking, who do we need to enlist to be kind of our trusted go-to person if we become incapacitated somehow? So think about that, and then think about now, what do you think those rules ought to be? Now, I would say, and this is a famous line that I always use, and that is, failure to make a decision is in fact a decision. So if this is one of those things you say, I'm not going to do, or I'm going to put off until next year, then that actually is a decision, which means that you may find yourself in circumstances where either you or somebody that loves you wished you'd made a decision, and it wasn't, so there's nothing in place. So we get to what can you do? What can you do now to protect your future retirement income if you live into your 80s and your 90s and beyond? We've talked about that. We could go on for the rest of the day on this, and I can see from the looks on your face you really wish I wouldn't. So again, I want to thank you very much for talking to you today, but I'm just at awe at the community service that is represented by the people in this room, and I think that we need to give you all an award too. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to another Relational Gravity podcast. Remember, it's about relationships, always.